Welcome. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. This is the MSPCA-Angell Pet Insurance webinar. Our goal today is going to be to empower you with information about pet insurance so you can make the best choices for you, your pet, and your budget. And who better to do this than the MSPCA-Angell's Harrison Stenson, our licensed pet insurance member here, and he will be taking questions at the end of this webinar. But first, he'll spend about 15-20 minutes filling you in on all the ins and outs of pet insurance. On a personal note, I've consulted Harrison myself for my own pets and have found him to be full of good information and advice. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of today. Harrison has been with the MSPCA-Angell for about 3 years and acquired his license last year for his insurance license and has been helping pet parents ever since in their choices and navigation of pet insurance policies and programs. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Harrison, and thank you very much for joining us, and we should have you out of here by 1 o'clock. Harrison, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again so much for coming. I will try to keep the presentation as entertaining as possible, but I understand it is a little dry, so just bear with me and hold on to your questions. So first, let's see. Right. Just a quick overview. There will be a slide about me, and then I'll talk about why I think pet insurance is something that all pet owners should consider, followed by some brief information about really important terms that you should know and understand when you're looking for a pet insurance policy, some discussion about what is covered, what is not covered, what is sometimes covered, and then some other things to consider, and then, as Bonnie mentioned, we'll move on to some questions. So about me, I live in Sturbridge, Massachusetts with my wife and our 3 cats. That's Lawrence, Gwen, and Ash. I'm originally from Georgia, but I've lived here since 2021. I had a job with Angell before I even moved up here, and I've loved working here since. As Bonnie mentioned, I am a licensed insurance producer and advisor through the Massachusetts Division of Insurance, specifically in the lines of property and casualty insurance. You would think pet insurance would be considered health insurance, but it's actually considered property and casualty insurance because health insurance is strictly speaking, according to the law, only for human beings. So there are 2 main things that people with pet insurance really speak to when they're recommending it. Number 1 is the financial security that it provides. Pet insurance is set up to provide a financial cushion for when unexpected, particularly expensive things come up. If any of you have had to bring your pet to the emergency room, or if you're working in veterinary medicine, you understand how quickly things can get expensive and how suddenly things can occur. So being prepared for that is a must. Some quick statistics: 1 out of every 3 pets receive emergency care every year. I think a lot of people are surprised by that number, especially newer pet owners. Typically, when a pet is young, they're not super likely to have to go, receive emergency care, have emergencies. But especially as a pet may age, that's going to become more and more likely. According to Care Credit, emergency vet visits can range anywhere from $250 to $10,000 or more, just depending on what's going on. I've seen this myself working in the hospital. I've seen emergency bills reach $15,000, $20,000. I think a lot of people, especially people who have never had to experience that kind of vet bill before, are usually very surprised to hear that it can cost so much. But unfortunately, veterinary medicine is expensive. It's often the same kind of medicine, same technology and procedures that are used in human healthcare, and it's much more expensive in human healthcare. According to a Harris poll from 2023, less than half of Americans around 45% have enough saved to cover $1,000 emergency without having to turn to a credit card or loans. That's a big reason to look into pet insurance, because I know putting down $5,000, $10,000 on a credit card is not easy to pay off in 30 days, and then you're accruing interest, and it's really easy to fall into a debt cycle in that way. So pet insurance is one really helpful way to stay out of that. Past the financial security, I think peace of mind is another super important factor to consider. Obviously, based on the above, when people don't have the money to pay for services that are being recommended, or it's really uncomfortable financially to pay for those services, it forces pet owners into really difficult, emotionally taxing decisions about what services they can afford for their pet. I know, most people, especially in Massachusetts, I think, really believe that their pets are part of their family, and the thought of not being able to pursue the recommended treatment plan because you can't afford it is really, really stressful and sad. And pet insurance is something that, if a pet owner has, you can walk into any emergency, especially if you get it when they're young and there's no pre-existing conditions. You can walk into any emergency room, any appointment, internal medicine, oncology, dermatology, anything like that, and feel comfortable that you have a financial cushion and that you don't have to make those really difficult emotional decisions based on finances. And I think for those of you working in veterinary medicine, pet health insurance just allows people to be able to say yes to their preferred treatment plan. I think, obviously cost of care always has to be part of the conversation, but I think we would all love to have to focus on that less and focus more on the care of the patient. So now we're moving on to sort of crash course on pet insurance. Here are some important terms that you're going to see a lot as you look for a policy. Number one is the reimbursement percentage. That is the amount or the percentage that the insurance company is going to reimburse to you based on the covered charges on a bill. Most commonly, you'll see this number between 70 and 90%. I have seen as low as 50 and as high as 100, but generally the 70 to 90% range is going to be the most cost effective. Often it's also referred to as a copay. That's a term that's often used in human healthcare, so that might be a more familiar term for you. Second is the deductible. So this is the amount that you have to pay out of pocket after the copay is factored in, before the insurance starts to reimburse you. So, for example, if you have a $1,000 bill and you have a 90% reimbursement rate and a $500 deductible, $900 of that $1,000 is eligible for coverage, but you have to pay that $500 out of pocket first, that deductible, and then the insurance company reimburses you for $400. If you scale that up a bit and you're looking at a $10,000 bill, then you're looking at $9,000, which is eligible for coverage. $500 you have to pay out of pocket to meet the deductible, but then the remainder $8,500 is reimbursed to you. Generally, deductibles are annual, meaning once it's met for the year, it is met until your policy renews starting the next year. But there are some. Trupanion is the one that has a unique deductible, which is per condition per lifetime. With them, any given condition has its own deductible, but once it's met for the rest of the pet's life. It doesn't reset every year. So it's great for pets that have chronic issues that require lots of treatment every year, or really big expensive things. But for pets that have lots of smaller issues come up throughout their life, then you're paying multiple deductibles. But there's pros and cons to that. Limits is a big one that's always worth considering. The annual limit is the most common one that you're going to run into. This is the most that a pet insurance company will reimburse to you within the policy period. That's the year-long policy. It's not based on the calendar year. It's based on the day that you sign up, and it's 365 days from there. I've seen limits even lower. The presentation says 5,000. I've seen lower. I've seen $2,500 limits, and I've seen as high as $40,000 or unlimited. Generally, for dogs, I recommend at least $15,000 per year. For cats, at least 10. But it depends on everybody's situation. An unlimited policy is often very helpful. Again, I have seen bills reach $20,000, $30,000. So you would really like to have an unlimited policy in that scenario. Lifetime limits are pretty uncommon, but that's a limit where an insurance company will only reimburse throughout the whole of a pet's life a certain amount of money. Again, very uncommon, but if there is one, it's usually extremely high, something around $100,000. And then the last one is per incident limits. These are, again, uncommon. These are something that I generally recommend avoiding. A per incident limit is basically meaning for any given either claim or diagnosis, even sometimes including chronic diagnoses, they would only pay a certain amount for that specific incident or diagnosis. The reason I recommend avoiding these, and again, they are uncommon because they're unpopular, is because if you have a chronic issue that is going to run up, many thousands of dollars over the pet's whole life, and you have a per incident limit, then once you hit that limit, say in year 2 of the policy, then it's, you're not getting any additional reimbursement for that issue for the rest of the pet's life. So I recommend avoiding those. Another term that you're going to want to be familiar with is direct pay, also known as direct to vet or direct to hospital payments. Generally speaking, pet insurance requires you to pay for services in full and submit a paid invoice to the insurance company to be reimbursed from the insurance company. However, more and more companies are creating options for payment to be made directly to the hospital. Each hospital has its own policies for who they accept direct pay from, if they accept it at all, because sometimes it's a lot of work to make happen. But if you're one of those people that cash flow is a concern for you, you don't think you could pay $1,000, $5,000, $10,000 out of pocket before you're reimbursed from the insurance company, an insurance company that offers some direct to hospital payment will be super helpful for you. Now we'll get into coverage, and this is coverage, again, is very specific based on each company, but these are the general, what's almost always covered, what's usually optional, and what's almost never covered. So among the things that are covered, and maybe before I get into this, I should specify, pet insurance is considered accident and illness insurance. It is not designed to cover your wellness costs, preventative costs. That's your annual exam, vaccinations, spay and neuter procedures, typically. Those are not usually covered by the accident and illness portion of an insurance policy. But I'll touch on wellness plans in just a moment. So for coverage, what's almost always covered is hospitalization, medications, surgery, medical supplies, diagnostic tests like blood work, cytologies, biopsies, and then imaging like x-rays, CT scans, ultrasounds, and MRIs. Additional things like prescription medications, I mentioned that already. I mentioned medical supplies already as well. Pretty much anything that is being used to provide a treatment or diagnostics, anything that you'll see on an estimate or a bill for an accident or illness is going to be covered by the typical pet insurance policy. Now, there are some things that are often optional, meaning that many plans cover these things by default. Many plans cover these things if you select a certain add-on, and then some plans don't cover them at all. Emergency/specialty exam fees is one of them. So as I said before, your wellness exam is not typically covered, but if you're bringing your pet to the emergency room or to a specialist, there's still an exam fee most of the time. And many insurance companies do cover this, not all of them though. And often it's an add-on that you have to click when you're checking out for the policy. Dental illnesses is another one that is often optional. It's often an add-on. That's things like periodontal disease, resorptive lesions, I'm not the dentist, but there's lots of dental illnesses that you can probably imagine. Um, Again, this is included by default in a lot of insurance policies, but sometimes it's optional. Um, and I'll specify that dental injuries, for example, if a pet were to be playing too hard with another dog, or bite something too hard and fracture a tooth through something considered an accident or injury, that would be covered by any insurance company. Dental illnesses are kind of a different uh, category. Another often optional thing is behavioral modification or behavioral consults. Um, and then there's things like rehab, physical therapy, breeding or pregnancy coverage, and then final respects, that being cremation or burial fees. Usually they only cover the fee, they don't cover a whole lot more than that. Um, and then in the almost never covered section, and this is a big one, is pre-existing conditions. I imagine I'll get some questions about pre-existing conditions at the end, so I'll try to define it as best as I can, but keep in mind each insurance company sort of defines things in their own way. Pre-existing conditions are any illness or injury that where symptoms were present prior to the start of the policy or during the waiting period. Um, that can mean a lot of different things. But generally, pet insurance companies are pretty strict with pre-existing conditions. That's a large reason why we recommend signing up your pet as soon as you adopt them, especially if they're young, because they're very unlikely to have any pre-existing conditions at that time. Again, what is almost never covered is routine wellness and preventive care. There are wellness add-ons that most insurance companies offer for extra premium. They are not insurance. They reimburse you for a set amount of wellness costs on a benefit schedule. For example, they will cover $50 of the annual exam fee per year, maybe $30 towards vaccinations, $30 towards flea and tick preventives, but they don't cover 90% like they do for the accidents and illnesses. Often the wellness add-ons are not the best deal in the world, although if you make full use of them, you can save money. And then outside of coverage, there's some other factors to consider. Customer service is obviously, I think, important, especially often when you're submitting a claim. You've just gone through something very stressful with your pet, and you don't want to get somebody on the phone that seems really rude or just doesn't understand what you're going through. So customer service is important. The quality and speed just varies from company to company, and I would bet also varies state to state to some extent. And some are also much easier to reach than others. There are some companies where you basically have to wait on hold for 30 minutes or go through a large phone tree, versus companies where you can just reach out to somebody via chat function very quickly. And then separate from the customer service, there's the claims experience itself. There are different approaches to claims processing from these insurance companies. There are some newer companies that are very tech forward, that rely really heavily on technology. For example, Lemonade, I believe everything goes through their app. So if you're not particularly tech savvy, that's definitely something to consider when you're looking for a company. At the same time, there are more traditional ones that require everything to be done through paper. So if you don't have a printer or don't have access to that kind of printer, scanner, fax machine on a regular basis, then you may want to look at an insurance company that you can do everything on your phone. Additionally, the turnaround times for claims can vary significantly from company to company. Generally, an insurance company only has up to 30 days to process a claim, as long as they have all the information they need. But they can request more time. So I have seen claims take as long as 45 days or longer, especially if they're missing information. At the same time, there are claims that are processed in under 5 minutes, just depending on which company and the specific situation. And then I think it's always worth referring to some consumer ratings websites, such as Trustpilot or Consumer Affairs, or even the Better Business Bureau, just looking at any complaints that an insurance company may have. Pet insurance is, relatively speaking, new-ish, especially in its current form. So I think companies are still developing the best practices, and hopefully regulators are soon to get on that train as well and sort of keep a close eye on the pet insurance industry since it's growing so quickly. And just a bit about our program. I am here to help. I can offer recommendations to any Massachusetts resident. You don't necessarily need to be a client of MSPCA-Angell. And the same for MSPCA-Angell clients. If you're not a Massachusetts resident, I can point you in the right direction, but I'm not licensed in any other states. But I am happy to offer personalized recommendations. Basically, there's some questions that I need some answers to figure out, what you're looking for and what your budget is, that kind of thing. And then from there, I can make some recommendations for you. Just for those of you who are planning to reach out to me, just keep in mind that the turnaround time is highly dependent on volume. If I don't have a large queue, then I can usually get it done in a couple days. But if I do have a lot of recommendations waiting, it can take 7 business days. All that to say, I am always here to put the client first, not the insurance company. We don't receive any sort of kickback or incentive from any of the insurance companies to recommend one over the other. My only interest is about what's best for you and your pet. And I think the insurance space really needed that, because it's there's a lot of different options in Massachusetts. There's like over 30 brands to pick from, and they're all gonna, if you look at their websites, they're gonna tell you certain things, and then they'll say certain things about their competitors. But having a non-biased, sort of third-party observer, I think is really, really valuable. Here is my contact information: insurance coordinator at mspca.org. And then my phone number is 617-655-9628. I will say up front, email is the easiest way to reach me. I get a lot of phone calls and it's difficult to keep up with them. And then some general information. We have some stuff on our website, some claims instructions, and then some other third-party resources: policy.com, petinsurancereview.com. Those are both really good websites where you can compare quotes between different companies and get coverage. Canine Journal has some reviews, and then Pet Insurance University, for those who are feeling particularly scholarly. It is a really deep dive into the specifics for each pet insurance company, and that's maintained by a veterinarian. And I think we are ready to move on to questions.
Thank you so much, Harrison. That's great. Always a bunch of helpful information. We already have a couple questions. As expected, there's one on pre-existing conditions. So you touched on that a little bit. People are wondering what should they do if they have a pet with pre-existing conditions. This person says they have a dog who gets seizures treated at Angell, but they're unclear about the best options. And maybe it's that, insurance doesn't cover the pre-existing conditions, but can cover everything else. I don't know. Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. So I think number one, while insurance typically doesn't cover pre-existing conditions, just because your pet has a pre-existing condition doesn't mean insurance would be a waste for you. Different issues can come up that are unrelated to the current condition. So it's always worth having that coverage, or at least getting a quote to see if it's affordable for you. For this question specifically, depending on the age of the pet, you may want to look at American Kennel Club. If this is a chronic condition and your pet is under the age of 9 years old, American Kennel Club for Massachusetts residents, it's not in every state, they do cover pre-existing conditions after the first year. So to put that in a short way, they will not cover pre-existing conditions for the first year of their policy, but it'll act, just like a normal insurance policy for any other non-pre-existing issue. Starting in the second year, though, it would then cover that issue, pre-existing or not. That is one of the newer and in more inventive attempts to get pre-existing conditions covered. And just provide some more context, usually pre-existing conditions aren't covered because if they were, the cost of insurance would be much higher. I think it would price a lot of people out of the insurance market, which would sort of probably cause it to collapse. But new companies are trying to find some ways to work in some pre-existing conditions coverage, and I think American Kennel Club's product is really valuable. As long as you're very aware that it's not going to cover that issue for the first year, second year and onward, they will. Also worth mentioning, ASPCA, not associated with the MSPCA, and Pumpkin, and there are a few, I think Embrace, maybe FIGO, do cover curable pre-existing conditions after they've been treatment and symptom-free for a certain amount of time. Just keep in mind that treatment does include prescription foods and medications, but if your pet has an issue like an ear infection or they threw up a couple of times, just because it happened once doesn't mean that that's pre-existing for the rest of their life. If it's been cured for a certain amount of time, a lot of insurance companies will no longer see that as pre-existing.
Great answer. And actually, you brought up FIGO, and there's a question about that. One of our attendees says they use FIGO through Costco, but they haven't used it for their cat or dog, and it's getting expensive. So they wondered if they should consider a different insurance. I think this is something a lot of people wonder about. They said both pets are still young with no pre-existing conditions. What's your take on that?
So I think if your pets are young and don't have any pre-existing conditions, I would super recommend looking around, seeing if you can find a better policy for you. I will say FIGO is usually on the lower side as far as premiums go, so you may not find a whole lot cheaper. But that said, switching insurance companies when there are pre-existing conditions, just keep in mind that if there is a let me start over. So if you switch companies, the new insurance company will not cover anything that the previous insurance company has covered, because when you start with a new policy, even if you had insurance with a different company, it's still going to be considered a pre-existing condition if it existed before this new policy. So if your pet does not have pre-existing conditions, then it's sort of free game to shop around. But if your pet does have stuff that your current insurance company has covered, usually the better alternative is to do one of three things. You can lower your annual limit. For example, a lot of people just get an unlimited policy because that feels the best when they're signing up, but unlimited amounts of coverage is not strictly necessary. If you can lower it to $20,000, $15,000, $10,000, that's going to bring your premiums down. Additionally, you can raise your deductible. For example, a lot of insurance companies recommend a pretty low deductible at like $250. Typically, I recommend as high a deductible as you can reasonably afford to pay out of pocket should something come up, because the savings and premiums are going to be worth that. You can also lower your reimbursement percentage. The typical one is 90, but you can lower that to 80 or 70. That's usually, to me, the last resort, because it makes it a lot harder to get the value out of the policy. The deductible is the one that, if your premiums are high, call your insurance company, ask about raising your deductible, and see how the premium changes. Often that's going to be a lot easier than switching companies. But if there are no pre-existing conditions, switching is an option.
Great. Okay, we're going to take a left turn here. Somebody's asking about adopting a puppy. And as is the case for a lot of adopters, they don't know the history of the health history of the animal. And if that's the case, what would you suggest considering when choosing insurance?
So number one, if you're adopting from a shelter or a breeder, just make sure to request any medical records they may have. Often it's just going to be a record of vaccinations, that kind of thing. But make sure to request all of it, just so that you have it, because the insurance company is going to ask for it in all likelihood. Often, though, there are pets in shelters or pets that you know adopt off the street. For example, one of my cats, when she was a kitten, I think she was abandoned or something like that. But she literally knocked on our door and just waltzed right in. So that happens all the time. And of course, I had no idea what sort of medical history she had. Um, it's not like they can tell us. So generally, in that case, when there is no existing history whatsoever, they'll use the first exam as the basis for any pre-existing conditions. So if, for example, if you're on the first, say you have a 9-month-old puppy that was picked up off the street, so you have really no idea what medical issues are there, if any. If at the first exam the puppy is totally healthy, then there's not going to be any pre-existing conditions. But if they find something like, obviously, if they find something serious, then that's going to be on the medical record, and that at that point would probably be considered a pre-existing condition. Um, I will specify common things that puppies get, especially when they're adopted from the street. Things like, small skin infections or fleas, ringworm. That kind of thing is not usually a big deal as far as pre-existing conditions. They're usually very curable and they don't cause long-term issues. And any But if you have concerns about that, just make sure your vet is very clear in the medical records. And I would also just be very upfront with your veterinarian that you have insurance. And if there's anything that you are wanting specifically to be clear in the medical record, just let that be known to them. Obviously, they're not going to lie for you. That would be insurance fraud, but they can be extra clear when needed.
Great. And that sort of relates to another question that somebody asked about whether or not the insurance companies require a full exam before they're enrolled in a policy. And it sounds like that is the case, to determine.
It varies. It varies depending on the company. There are some brands that for either the entirety or specific parts of coverage to be in effect, you have to make sure that your pet gets an annual every year. I think we would probably recommend that your pet gets an annual every year, no matter what. But definitely keep that in mind if you're not somebody that usually brings your pet for services every year. Some insurance companies want you to do that. And I think that's just good in general, just to make sure you catch anything that you're not noticing. Pets are obviously can't speak English, so they can't always tell us when they're uncomfortable. I'm forgetting the question at this point.
No, I think you've answered it.
Okay, great.
We're just talking pre-existing conditions, whether an exam is necessary.
Yes.
So let's move on to the next one. This is something I think everybody wonders, and it's really hard to answer because every pet is different. But somebody's asking, what is the average monthly cost for pet insurance for a relatively healthy dog? And I know this depends on deductibles and all sorts of factors, but if you could give people a sense of what can they expect to spend on the low end or the high end for a pet that's relatively healthy.
So this is a good time to mention what factors affect your premium. So there are a number of factors. Your pet's species and breed affect your premiums pretty drastically. Generally, mixed breed pets are cheaper to insure because they're less likely to have the kind of congenital or hereditary issues that purebred pets are more prone to. Your zip code affects premiums. Your pet's age affects premiums, and to some extent, your pet's whether they're male or female can affect premiums as well. That said, based on 2023 data, so this is outdated, the North American Pet Health Insurance Association listed the average monthly premium for a dog, the national average, to be around $50 a month. Keep in mind, 2024 has been a big year for inflation all around. Vet costs have increased fairly significantly due to a lot of varying factors. inflation being part of it. And because of those vet cost increases, premium increases have also gone up. So while I don't have an official source for you as for an average, I would suspect for a dog, the monthly average probably is now around maybe $65 per month, maybe 70. This is sort of ballpark. For cats, it's usually typically lower. I would suspect probably $40 to $50 per month on average. All that
Great.
said, a young cat or dog is usually going to be much more expensive. With most insurance companies, you do need to be prepared for your premiums to go up uh, on a yearly basis. Um, Most pet insurance companies factor your pet's age in at renewal, so you won't see it go up all that much from kitten or puppyhood to adulthood. But once they start reaching the senior age, you will see it go up more typically. Trupanion is the exception; they don't raise their rates like that. But keep in mind that rising vet costs and other economic factors also impact premiums.
You bring up Trupanion, and that's another good thing to talk a little bit about, because while they claim not to raise prices based on your pet's age each year, they do raise their prices. So I think, setting that expectation that just because they don't raise it because of the animal's age, you should brace yourself for some increases. And I think a lot of
It
people
will.
wonder, once those prices start going up, well, is now the time that I should switch? What's your answer to that?
Once the prices start going up, I think it's worth remembering that you're probably not going to get that much better a deal with a different company, no matter who you're with. Um, or if you do find something that's much cheaper, it's usually cheaper for a reason, whether or not that be because they take 45 days to process claims, or their customer service isn't very good, or their coverage isn't as expansive. So just keep all that in mind. There are risks when switching companies. Um, Usually, what I recommend is, especially when they're young, signing up for a more expensive policy, that being a higher annual limit, or an unlimited policy, average deductible, and a 90% reimbursement rate. Because it's usually very affordable, and if anything happens at that time, it's covered at those sort of really high coverage levels. But then as they get older, if your premiums are really starting to put pressure on your wallet, that's when I recommend considering lowering the annual limit, raising the deductible, lowering the reimbursement percentage, because that's going to bring your premiums down. But keep in mind that you can usually downgrade your coverage for a cheaper premium, but you cannot upgrade. So if you sign up a young pet with the cheapest policy possible, keep in mind that you will not be able to upgrade it as they get older, because you won't have paid in the same amount as all the other pet owners to the pool of available funds to cover claims. Um, so, in but if you are looking at switching, just make sure that there's look over the medical records, make sure that there's nothing that the new company will pick out and say, "Oh, this is pre-existing," because that could get you in trouble.
Great. Um, and along the lines of pricing, somebody asks, have you had examples of owners canceling their pet insurance and saving money in the long run, or the opposite, where they regretted it? This person says they often hear success stories of owners saving $10,000 from a surgery, but it would be sad if they've been putting down $100 a month when they never end up using it. And I guess that's sort of the nature of insurance of any type. But
Yeah, I think that's some, when you're looking at insurance policies, you definitely need to approach it knowing that insurance is not a guaranteed savings tool. Insurance is there to take on the risk of large bills, in exchange for a monthly premium. So definitely, I'm not saying that you are guaranteed to get your money out of any insurance policy, because if nothing happens, then you don't need it. I mean, insurance is something that you don't want to have to use, because that means your pet's going through something. So generally, if people are looking for something, if they're only interested in insurance if it's a guaranteed savings, I typically tend to tell them that insurance may not be what they're looking for, and direct them to, pay what they're paying in premiums, just put that in a savings account instead, or something along those lines. But of course, that takes a lot of discipline that not everybody has, myself included. I really like DoorDash. What was the rest of that question?
Just wondering if you'd encountered people who have had regrets
Yes.
over it.
So I feel like I've definitely encountered more people who have regretted canceling their policy, but that may just be the nature of me working at an animal hospital. There are absolutely people who had a policy when their pet was young and healthy and then canceled it because they weren't using it. And then a couple of years later, something comes up and they're kicking themselves for having canceled the policy because now they're really struggling to pay for a bill. I mean, if you Google, should I get pet insurance, you'll definitely see articles that say like, you'll see a lot of mixed opinions. You'll definitely see people that are telling you, it's just going to be easier to not get the insurance and just save money in some different way. And that's totally an option. Just keep in mind, it takes time to save enough money to pay for something like that. So if something comes up and you haven't saved appropriately yet, then you're still in hot water. And also, other things come up. And if you need that money for something else, then all of a sudden it's gone. Whereas the insurance company, it's not like you can access that money in a different way. I definitely hear more people regret canceling versus people regretting signing up. The only times I typically see people regret paying into a policy for an extended amount of time is when they didn't understand that their pet had a pre-existing condition, or they didn't understand that something in their pet's medical history would be considered a pre-existing condition. And so this whole time they've expected when something comes up that it will be covered, and then it's actually pre-existing. So just be very aware of what's on your pet's medical record. And if you think the insurance company may have questions about how that will be interpreted, get clarification from your veterinarian. That's going to help you a lot.
Great. So we're nearing the end of the webinar. I just want to encourage people, if they have any last questions, to enter them in our Q&A section here. We still have another one for you, Harrison. People wondering about recommendations for wellness plans for dogs in combination with insurance. You mentioned a little bit about that in your slides, but tell us a little bit more.
So most of the time, the wellness plan is an add-on that you can add on to your insurance policy. If you are looking at quotes, usually as you're going through the quote process, like selecting what kinds of coverage, the wellness thing will be there. You can almost always click for more information, especially if there's a benefit schedule where you can see exactly what's covered. I just recommend doing the math like, okay, it's going to cost this much per month and I get this amount of benefits. Let's see if this math works out. There are a couple of policies that are unique though. Pumpkin's policy, their preventive essentials add-on, I believe it's what it's called, covers 90%, or it might even be 100 of a very small amount of wellness items. So while you're not getting as many different things covered partially, you're getting a few things that you are going to know that your pet is going to need pretty much every year, covered at a much higher rate. To me, that's a better investment, and then just planning for your other various wellness costs, because those are usually more predictable. If you're wondering about how much wellness stuff does cost, talk to your veterinarian. They should be able to give you at least some ballpark of what am I going to be paying every year when I come. It's usually lower for young pets, and as they get older, there's more stuff to check on. There is also MetLife's policy, depending on which underwriter. So I'm not totally confident in recommending this, but I do believe it's an option where there are policies that are underwritten by, I think it's MetGen, like actually underwritten by MetLife, do cover wellness stuff, wellness costs, like the accident and illness insurance. So they cover, but it's part of the annual limit, but they cover 90% once the deductible is met. Just keep in mind any costs that you submit for wellness stuff will that money, the annual limit is reduced by that amount. So if an accident or injury, something unexpected happens, something you can't plan for, then there's not as much money available. I also just hesitate to recommend that because Nationwide non-renewed a lot of policies recently, and those policies were the policies that covered wellness in that way. So I question whether or not that is profitable in the long term for an insurance company to cover wellness costs like that. So I just hesitate to recommend it because I'm not confident it'll be around that long. But pumpkins I really like. And then for any other one, just check out the schedule of benefits and do the math.
Okay, so Pumpkin and MetLife were the two that you had mentioned.
Yeah, those are the unique ones. Everything else is the schedule of benefits.
Okay, great. And one other thing that I don't think we have talked about is avian and exotic pets. A lot of people, obviously dogs and cats are the bulk of what we're talking about today, but there's an increasing popularity with everything from rabbits to birds. Tell us a little bit about coverage available for those species.
So at this time in Massachusetts, there's only one option for accident and illness insurance for avian exotic pets. That's Nationwide Pet Insurance. They require pet owners to call in to a number that's on their website to get a quote. So I'm not as familiar with that product, but I know a lot of our avian exotic pet owners do have that and are fairly happy with it. So, I mean, it's definitely something I recommend. I think a lot of people, when they get something like a hamster or gerbil or bunny or a bird, expect vet costs to be lower for those animals. And let me tell you, they are not. They may be marginally lower for wellness costs, but emergency care is still emergency care, and it is more expensive than you probably think it is. So just because you don't view an animal as expensive as a cat or a dog, I think it's definitely still worth looking into insurance. I think their plans start at around $21 per month, which is very affordable comparatively. So definitely worth looking into Nationwide's coverage. And if another company does start to offer avian exotics coverage in Massachusetts, that's definitely, we would love to see that. And we've reached out to insurance companies to ask, is this coming? And as of right now, I'm not aware of any product that's, on the horizon, but I will definitely keep my eyes open.
Great. And I think last question, I bet a lot of people are wondering, do you have pet insurance for your cats?
I do.
And have
yes.
you ever used it?
So let me preface this by saying I wish I had gotten it earlier. My cat Ash, she was the black one from the slide with the pictures. She is the apple of my eye, and when I was in college, she got into some lilies, which, if you aren't aware, are toxic to both cats and dogs, I believe. And it's really serious. It can put them into kidney failure, I believe, very, very quickly. So I had to rush her to the University of Georgia emergency vet. And at this time, I didn't know about pet insurance. I just didn't know that it even existed. And so I had to, crowdfund the costs for her services. And then it turned out, incidentally, that she also had a congenital diaphragmatic hernia. So some of her organs were not where they were supposed to be. They were going into her chest cavity. So she had to have surgical repair of that as well. $5,000 later, I really wish that I had pet insurance and that I had gotten it when she was a kitten, because it would have covered almost all of that. And since learning about all of this, I have gotten insurance. Thankfully, my cats have not gotten sick since I got the insurance, so I haven't had to use it yet. But I do feel a lot better knowing that it's there when needed.
Yeah, yeah. I think we all do when we have it. Thank you so much, Harrison. This is really helpful, and thank you all for joining us and spending your lunchtime with us. Again, if you have questions, additional questions that you think of for Harrison, or you want to tap his brain for advice on your own pet situation, you can go to mspca.org/pet insurance and see all sorts of information there, as well as his contact information. So please do use this resource, and thank you again for attending. That wraps it up. All right.